Good morning to everybody. Open your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 3. I just always have so much to pack into a class that I want to just milk every single minute for what it's worth and give you the most amount of value that I possibly can. So we're going to hit the ground running here as we begin our study of the book of Proverbs. Of course, studying God is part of growing spiritually. So the growth process is to worship God and study His Word and love one another and reach the lost, something we need to constantly keep before us and challenge ourselves to see where we are on that growth cycle. On Wednesday, Brian talked about the book of Proverbs. He introduced the book of Proverbs and he covered the first two chapters. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to cover chapters 3 through 9, Lord willing. That's my plan. We are still in the section of the fatherly instructor, chapters 1 through 9. You just see this repetition of my son, my son, my son, my son. And the way that we need to understand that for us as it applies to us, although Solomon was writing this to his son, the application for us is as sons of God. And the Holy Spirit was working through Solomon, and so this is God speaking to us as His sons. I'll tell you a little bit more why I have that opinion in a minute. Let's go ahead and read the first 12 verses of chapter 3. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord, nor loathe His reproof. For whom the Lord loves, He reproves, even as a father corrects the son in whom He delights. So it's a pretty packed section here. Verses 5 and 6 are some of the most well-known verses in the book of Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. It's just a great verse, a great passage, 2 verses, to know, to memorize and to carry around with you, to always be reminded that it's not up to us to guide our paths and to know which way to go. The Lord will direct those for us. We see in this section also the importance of remembering godly teaching constantly. Verse 1, do not forget my teaching. Verse 3, do not let kindness and truth leave you. So Solomon, writing this to his son, was really wanting his son to remember these things forever. Isn't that the desire that all of us parents have when we're trying to train and teach our children? We want this stuff to stick. There's a verse in Proverbs that I'm sure you're well aware of, in Proverbs 22 and verse 6. What does that verse say, Phil? Train up a child, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. I saw you over there kind of quoting it, so I gave you the chance just now, put you on the spot. Sorry about that. You did just fine. So that's the goal that we have as parents. It's frustrating that you can't completely control what your children end up doing. But we want to do our level best to lead them down that path so that it'll stick and they'll remember this stuff forever. And Solomon talks about the benefits of seeking the Lord. Verse 2, what is the benefit? If you were to just summarize that, what is the benefit there in that verse? Long life. Verse 4, what's the benefit there? A good reputation. And so favor with God and men. And verse 6, straight paths. Verse 8, healing to your body. Verse 10 talks about basically wealth, which is, we need to make sure we have some balance how we're viewing this. This is not the health and wealth gospel. This is not the prosperity gospel. It's not what this is saying. But the idea of those who live a moral lifestyle, those who are honest and have integrity and so forth and do what is right, they tend to be blessed in this life as well. Now, in the context of the first century Christians, they suffered a lot. Why? Persecution from Rome. And so that was a particular situation in the first century. But generally speaking, when you live a moral lifestyle, you wind up being more blessed. Now, that's a general rule. It's not always the case, for sure. We'll come back to that a little bit. Verses 11 and 12 are quoted in Hebrews chapter 12. This is really fascinating. In Hebrews chapter 12, where Christians were suffering terribly, listen to what the writer of Hebrews says. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. And you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by Him. For those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines, and He scourges every son whom He receives. So you see why I think that the best way to view in Proverbs all these my son statements is view them as God speaking to us as sons. Because the writer of Hebrews makes that very point. Even though Solomon did originally write it for his son, or with that sort of indication. But another point we get here is the suffering that we endure in this life can be viewed as discipline. Now, that doesn't mean that we've done something wrong and God is getting on to us and disciplining us by sending suffering. The point is, just like discipline helps a child and improves their character, and you do it because you love them. Have you ever experienced the kind of the deer in the headlights look when you tell your child, when you're about to spank them or discipline them some other way, I'm doing this because I love you. And they look at you like, this doesn't feel like love at all. Well, it is love. It really is love, because if you don't do it, they're going to be far worse off if you just ignore any discipline. And so God knows that about us, that we need this, quote, discipline of the suffering and trials of this life to develop our character and to make us better. So the Hebrews writer uses this passage from Proverbs 3 to make that point. In verses 13 through 26 of Proverbs 3, he talks about the value of wisdom. It's better than gold. It's better than silver. It's better than jewels. What could be more desirable than having a whole bunch of money in our world's eyes? Well, Solomon says, I'll tell you what's more valuable. And he knew, because he had all the money in the world. It is wisdom. It is wisdom. There's a repetition of a lot of the other blessings of wisdom that were stated earlier. I love verse 18. I want to look at that verse. Talking about wisdom. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast. Tree of life takes us back to the Garden of Eden. And this source of sustenance that would give you life. In fact, if they hadn't sinned, they could have just kept living on forever. And so wisdom gives us life. It gives us spiritual life. So many other things are stated there in that section. Verses 27 through 35 tell us principles of wisdom, such as don't withhold good from those to whom it is due. If you owe somebody money, if somebody's earned money from you, well, don't keep telling them, I'll give it to you later when I'm ready, because maybe you kind of want to use the money for yourself. Go ahead and pay them. Don't make trouble with others, and so forth. A lot of practical advice. But let me kind of go back to this idea of the benefits of wisdom and remind you what we looked at earlier. Long life, favor in the sight of God and man, straight paths, healing to your body, wealth. He also talks about fearlessness in verses 24 through 26. Which benefit of wisdom most stands out to you that we just kind of talked about? Which one of those really jumps out at you?
Closer relationship with God.
Okay. Relationship with God? Good. Jason?
I think it applies to a lot of different situations in life, but wisdom, when you have wisdom to know what's important, to know what's right, to know what's good, to know what's bad, it allows you to have a certain amount of peace. So, for instance, you might recognize that you are physically blessed even though you're not rich, in the grand scheme of things, the only thing we need on here on earth is to be able to, meet those daily needs. And so wisdom provides us the ability to see both the forest and the trees, so to speak.
Good. Yeah, great point. We can find a deeper happiness than this world when we have wisdom. Somebody over here, John, you had your hand up earlier too.
I was just thinking verse 4, because it also says here, find favor in the sight of men about wisdom, being honest, truthful, and things of this nature. But there are situations where some people do, they may have those virtues, and there could be scenarios where those people have been put into a situation, maybe a business or work scenario, where maybe upper management or executive management isn't so truthful, okay? And maybe this worker sometimes doesn't necessarily want to go along with their ways, all right? And their way of making money or whatever that could be. So they're not going to, obviously, these men are not going to find favor in someone who has the wisdom of God, because they're not going to play their games.
Right.
So you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
Okay? However, the greatest blessing at that point should be, even though you might be suffering and taking some hits, you need to look and think a little deeper that someone eternally is looking at this, and there's a blessing there. You can't see it, you think about it, and have your faith on it. It's not happening here in the 3D world we live in.
Right.
That's something you have to meditate on.
Yes.
Because sometimes having those things and having those virtues don't necessarily find favor with men.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And sometimes the greatest blessings, actually always the greatest blessings, are the spiritual blessings. And no matter what happens in this life, we can keep that in mind. I have to move forward. Proverbs 4, Solomon in the first 9 verses recalls the instruction of his father. It's pretty fascinating here. Proverbs 4, 3 and 4, when I was a son to my father, tender and the only son in the sight of my mother, then he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments, and live. Who was Solomon's father? David. I did a sermon a while back on the fact that David made a lot of mistakes parenting, and we need to avoid the parenting mistakes that David made. He did not wield the godly influence on his children that he should have. However, he did make a valiant effort, at least with Solomon. He really tried to teach Solomon, and we know that from this passage here. One of the major points we can get from this section is to listen to the advice of our fathers, our earthly fathers, just like Solomon listened to the advice of his father. I think of my dad. His name is Tony, and he has lots of, we call them Tonyisms, and he's just, we're country in North Alabama where I'm from, and he has a lot of things that he says, like, does a cat have climbing gear? He says that a lot. Or this is one piece of driving advice he gave me: expect other drivers to be stupid most of the time, and you won't be disappointed. And that's pretty well true. Just practical words of advice, but he also gave me a lot of spiritual advice. Remember him telling me that he had bought a satellite back when people still, bought those things, a satellite dish. He had bought that. My brother was a teenager at the time. Then my dad, before he ever hooked it up, he learned of the kinds of things that could be accessed through satellite dish. And he said he just left it in the box and never hooked it up. He didn't send it back to the store. He didn't try to sell it or anything. He just left it in the box and never hooked it up. And that always really stuck with me as being very, very cautious about what we let our kids be exposed to and so forth. So yes, I listened to the advice of my father, and I carry that with me, and I pass that on to my kids. And that's part of the point of this section. Verses 10 through 19, take hold of wisdom. Turn away from evil. Again, a repetition of some of the blessings of wisdom previously mentioned. But look in verses 14 and 15. Proverbs 4, 14 and 15. Let me make sure I'm in the right place. Yeah. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not proceed in the way of evil men. Avoid it. Do not pass by it. turn away from it and pass on. There's this constant theme throughout Proverbs of staying far away from evil. He doesn't just say, hey, stay away from those bad influences. He says, don't even pass by their path. Like, here's the path, here's where they normally go. I'm going to go out of my way to avoid that very path. So we stay very far away from sin. We're going to revisit that concept as we look at some other passages. In verses 20 through 27, pay attention to instruction. Verse 23 is, bar none, my favorite verse in the book of Proverbs. It says, guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it flow the springs of life. Now, the concept here is that your heart is a spring. Now, what water could be more pure than spring water? They bottle water from springs here in Florida. Let's say that you owned a spring on your property, and one day somebody backs up a truck and says, I'm going to dump all this trash in your spring. And you say, no, you're not. And they said, well, yes, I am. No, you're not. And they put up a fight. My property, my spring, I'm going to put up a fight. You're not dumping your trash in my spring. That's kind of the picture here. It's a fierce guarding of the spring of your heart from filth. Because if that spring gets polluted, then what's going to happen to all the streams and rivers that flow from that spring? Well, they're going to all be polluted too. And so we guard the spring of our heart. What did Jesus say about the heart? Out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. So if we don't guard our heart, what's going to happen to the rest of our lives? It's going to be totally corrupted. Totally corrupted. So that's where it all starts. So I really encourage you to memorize Proverbs 4 and verse 23. Teach it to your children. Verses 25 through 27, look at those verses. Let your eyes look directly ahead and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the path of your feet and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right nor to the left. Turn your foot from evil. There was a point in Solomon's life where he did have that commitment. And that's the kind of commitment we need to have. Just be very cautious and diligent to stay on that path and not veer from it. Now let me ask you all, what are some practical ways that we can guard our hearts today? Think about that. What are some practical ways that we in our culture today, with all the threats that are out there, can guard and protect fiercely the spring of our heart? What thoughts do you have on that? Brenda?
All the music that we listen to, everything
Good.
on the radio, anything on the TV, any of these devices that we have.
Yes.
Just constantly
Yes.
oversee it.
Yeah, when you sing stuff, you're basically internalizing and memorizing it. I used to sing a lot of Dave Matthews when I was in college, and I still like a lot of Dave Matthews songs, but he is very, very worldly. And sometimes I wouldn't pay attention. I'd be singing these songs that are about drugs and about terrible things, about drinking, and I just like the tune. And I'm internalizing these terrible messages, polluting my own heart voluntarily. So that's a great example. Let's do Chloe and then Randy.
Be careful with who you're around.
Be careful with who you're around.
It's not just what you see, but it's also the influences you have around you too.
Absolutely. Yeah. 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good morals. Very good. Randy?
And it's tied into the parenting thing. We know through psychology that the mind is much more receptive on an unconscious level. In other words, if kids will say, I want to listen to music while I'm studying. Well, if you listen to something consciously that has worldly stuff, you'll reject it. But if you're doing something else and it's in the background, it'll go right through your defenses. That's what we need to be able to aware of.
Yeah, kind of the background noise.
Yeah.
Some people leave their TV on for like 8 hours a day. And those commercials are horrible. And the TV shows are horrible a lot of times too, and it's just filtering through. I have to move forward. Proverbs 5, good thoughts. It takes a lot of discipline to be a teacher. because you got to kind of move things along. And we could talk about this stuff to the end of class on that one chapter. I'm sorry to move past some of your excellent comments. Proverbs 5, the first 6 verses, wisdom regarding women. We see sort of this introduction of a major theme that's going to be consistently interwoven through chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so he says here, the adulteress is a smooth talker, but she will destroy you. And then he says in 7 through 14, don't waste your life on the immoral woman. Of course, sadly, Solomon does waste his life on the immoral women. But there was a time when he recognized the wisdom of avoiding that. And of course, God is speaking to us here. Look at verses 7 and 8. Now then, my sons, listen to me and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house. Again, this idea that you don't just want to kind of avoid evil. You want to really avoid, you want to stay far, far away from it. I have a sermon where I talk about learning to actually hate evil and to move from don't do to don't desire to detest. So if sin's over there, here I am, I'm not doing it. Then I move over here, I'm not desiring it. Then I move over here, I detest it. That's the safest place to be. We like to be right here. I'm not doing it, but we're still desiring it, and we don't hate it, and we reach across the line, and we grab that forbidden fruit, and we mess up all the time. And so this concept here, over and over in Proverbs, stay far away. In this particular passage, it's regarding the immoral woman. Don't even go near the door of her house. He goes on to say, if you're not careful to avoid her, she will rob you of your youth, of your strength, of your possessions, and of your health, and you will regret that you did not listen to instruction. So then he says in 15 through 20, enjoy a relationship with your wife. Drink water from your own well and not someone else's. Be fully satisfied with your wife and with no one else. And he ends the chapter saying, remember, God sees all. The wicked will not escape the consequences of his deeds. Let me ask you this question at the end of this chapter. On a practical level, how can a young person avoid getting anywhere near the door of the immoral woman? And I don't just literally mean a door on a house of an immoral woman, but use that kind of as a symbol that can apply to other things. How can the young man avoid getting anywhere near to the door of the immoral woman? Let me get somebody that hasn't answered yet first. Debbie?
Well, things like in workplaces or schools, you want to stay, you want to be in public. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be alone with anybody else, especially somebody of the opposite gender.
Yeah.
And even more so somebody that's married. But, you see it just amazes me. You see all these women who are taking advantage of young men in the schools. Yeah. It's like amazing. Yeah, and there can be work situations that maybe a young man and a young woman are on a team together and they go out to lunch together to talk business. And there's, maybe no bad intentions there, but you're putting yourself in harm's way. Pretty much every preacher that I know has a rule that you don't meet with a member of the opposite gender. You don't meet with a woman in private. And so if I ever have a study with a woman, I'm going to make sure that somebody else is there, like Holly, or that Brian is here at the building and the door to my office is open, and I'll explain that to the lady. Let's not close the door. We're going to keep this door open just to avoid any even bad appearances, and so forth. So, good. What else? What are some other ways, Jack?
You really can't avoid it in Florida because there are too many people wearing bikinis on the street, and it is a difficult problem.
Sure.
The thing you can do is look away as quickly as you can. Right. Men have the threat assessment in them that they always look at a person who's there, see whether somebody's going to jump out into the street, is going to kill somebody or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
But you don't have to stare.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And, a good training time for your children is if you're watching a movie and anything a little immodest pops up. I do this with my boys. My oldest boy is 13 and Stone is 10. And we're watching even like Disney movies, and it'll be a lady that's not not completely appropriately dressed, they instantly recognize it. They know. And we just know what we do is we just look away. And we wait on Holly or June to say, all right, it's safe to look again. So let's move now to Proverbs chapter 6. Thank you for those great comments. Verses 1 through 5, he says, if you've made a bad deal, get out of it quickly. And he's talking about here if you've co-signed for another man's debts, or maybe the application could be also if you've made a bad sort of business partner agreement and you see that person is kind of a deadbeat, he's not holding up his end of the bargain, that was a foolish decision, and he says, be extremely urgent to fix the problem. Go to the man humbly and persuade him to let you out of this contract. I think that's the idea of this passage. It's not saying it's a sin to co-sign. It's saying to exercise wisdom. It's not saying it's a sin to be a partner with somebody in business. It's saying be careful about that, and if you've gotten yourself in a bad situation, if you're not careful, it can ruin your life. And so get yourself out quickly, deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter. Verse 5. Interestingly, now, I love Dave Ramsey. He's the money guy on the radio. And y'all know that I love Dave Ramsey because every time you ask me how I'm doing, I always say better than I deserve. And I learned that from Dave Ramsey. I really like his financial advice. I've been trying to follow him, through the years. He uses this passage in Proverbs 6 and verse 5 to talk about the intensity we need to have about getting out of debt. In fact, in his series, he has a video series on his debt lesson. There's this dramatic point where he shows this video of a gazelle running from a cheetah. And 9 times out of 10, the gazelle can get away from a cheetah because of the sheer intensity and everything. And he talks about getting out of debt, and he gets all emotional about that. And I never realized that he was misusing the passage. Because this passage is not talking about getting out of debt at all. It's talking about you are liable to pay somebody else's debts and get yourself out of that contract. That's what it's talking about in the context. Do I like his advice? Do I think it's a good idea to be gazelle intense, as he says, about getting out of debt? Absolutely. I think it's really hard. But yes, I think that's great advice, but that's not actually what this passage is really talking about. So I just wanted to kind of point that out.
Talking about co-signing.
Yes, it is co-signing. It is co-signing. Verses 6 through 11, do not be lazy. He tells us to go to the what? Go to the ant. My kids love to watch nature shows. And we were watching one the other day, and they just looked like ants that were like this army carrying these pieces of grass, and nobody's telling them what to do, and they know right where to go. It is really pretty neat stuff. We need to be like that. I heard someone recently say that he knew of someone that worked all the time and never worked. How do you work all the time and never work? Well, there's ESPN.com, and there's Facebook, and and then a little bit of work, and then Facebook, and whatever. When we're working, we need to work. And not that you can't ever take breaks, but sometimes we're just lazy and not hard workers in this society. So it's a good lesson. Of course, sometimes in America we are overworkers as well. In verses 12 through 15, cursed is the perverse man with shifty eyes and shuffling feet. Picture of he's just looking for trouble. He's just a busybody. His calamity will come upon him suddenly. 16 through 19, 7 things the Lord hates. Let's read that. Chapter 6, 16 through 19. There are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7, which are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among his brothers. Common thread through all of these 7 sins is deception and seeking personal gain at the expense of others. God hates those sins. God hates all sin. It's been drilled into the minds of our society that God is just this great loving being, and nobody wants to talk about how he hates sin and so forth. But the fact is, God hates sin. Wisdom literature uses strong terms like abomination and hate to describe God's attitude towards sin. And it's healthy for us to realize that, because if God feels that way, we should feel that way. And if God hates sin in the most wicked person that we know, then guess who He also hates sin in?
Everybody.
Ourselves. Exactly. Coming back to the theme of the immoral woman, verses 20 through 35 emphasize the lessons of the parent that will protect you from the harlot. He says in chapter 6 and verse 25, "Do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her capture you with her eyelids." I'll talk more about that in my lesson today. I've got triple duty today. Thanks, Brian. But don't even desire her beauty in your heart. It's not a matter of just avoiding the act. And look at 27, 28. "Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Or can a man walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched?" You know, what do we say in today's vernacular? If you play with fire, you're going to get burnt. You are going to get burnt. And so that's absolutely true. Young people need to remember that. Old people as well, but especially young people. In their dating relationships and the women and the men that they're seeking after, that if you're getting the wrong person who's after the wrong things, don't think that you can kind of just tamper with that and not be affected by that. Now let me ask a question. How can a young man prevent his heart from desiring the beauty or from lusting after the immoral woman? We kind of maybe talked about that a little bit earlier, but do you have any suggestions on how can a young man prevent himself from lusting after a woman? Let's see. First, is anybody who hasn't answered need to give an answer? And then we'll see if those have already given an answer. Nobody who hadn't answered wants to throw one out there yet? Vanessa?
One of the things you have to do is look for the beautiful woman, the godly beautiful woman.
Great.
Not look for that seductress woman.
Good point.
Godly woman isn't a prude.
Right.
They don't have to, it doesn't mean that they're a prude. There is a beauty that is godly.
Yes.
That is what you should be looking for, which you should be looking for God anyways. So that goes hand in hand. If you're not looking for God, you're not going to look for a godly woman.
Yeah, so look for that worthy woman whose price is above jewels, right? Proverbs 31. Very good. Very good thought. All right. Let's do Brenda and then Chloe. Go ahead, Brenda.
I was just going to say, Joe said I made a contract with my house.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that in the lesson as well. Very good. Make a contract or a covenant with your eyes. Chloe?
I think another way you can avoid is going along with looking for a godly woman. You should also realize, like, part of the thing you're looking for isn't how they look or any of that. It's how they act. So
Very
a
good.
lot of the worldly women aren't going to even act appropriately, or you do see a difference. There is a difference. It's not just the way they look, and that's a lot of it.
That's great. And it's this idea of, Paul talks about lasciviousness. And so it's a lot of times the way that women and men present themselves. So look for the right, kind of person. That's a great point. Tom?
This came up, not this particular topic, but in general sin with Caleb yesterday. And if you put yourself in places and in events and at times even where, like your father said, most drivers are stupid, you won't be disappointed. There are situations where you just have to make a decision not to be at those places, at those times, in those events.
Yes.
As the others have said, watching that thing, and it's hard to do, but you remove from your life at least that group of potential.
Great point. So don't put yourselves in harm's way. Let's do Jack. And then
Chloe had a slumber party, and she had a bunch of kids over there, some of whom were daughters rather, of the members of the church. My daughter made a comment afterwards. She said, "You can tell the church kids from the other kids." She said they talk different, they dress different, the things that they want to do are different.
Sure.
That's it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Bill?
One point is something like, on a river you have a dam, okay? And I can compare that to sin, okay? The water that comes to the dam. The closer and closer it gets to the dam, the stronger the pull is to the individual sin.
Yeah.
So if you get close enough to the sin, which is the dam, what happens? As you get closer, it pulls you closer and closer until finally you go over the dam.
Yeah.
And so the foot should not get close to the dam or sin, because the closer you get, the more likely it will be that you will go over the dam.
Good point. Yeah. Or I had the thought of like a gravitational pull with planets. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Just stay far away. And I would say also just realizing what lust leads to. Is it going to lead to anything good? Anything to be proud of? No, nothing. It can really ruin your life. And so just by really realizing what it leads to is a great way to learn to avoid that. Proverbs 7. Great points, everybody. Thank you so much. Proverbs 7, verses 1 through 23. We're still following this theme here. Avoid the immoral woman. He says, keep in mind your father's words to deliver you from the immoral woman. And let's listen to what God says, or what Isaiah says here, and God through Isaiah. Solomon, starting verse 6, chapter 7, verse 6. For at the window of my house I looked out through my lattice, and I saw among the naive and discerned among the youths a young man lacking sense, passing through the street near her corner. And he takes the way to her house. In the twilight, in the evening, in the middle of the night, and in the darkness. And behold, a woman comes to meet him dressed as a harlot and cunning of heart. So, not a good situation. He's not paying attention. He's not avoiding the door of the immoral woman. He's getting close, and he's heading that direction, and she comes out to him. She's one who is looking for trouble. She's dressed like a harlot, but she's not actually a harlot. She's married. But she's dressing this way to present herself to draw men to her. So she comes to him, and she flatters him, makes him feel like the most important person on earth, which is something men love. And she pretends to be righteous. I've offered my peace sacrifices. And out of the same breath, she invites him to come and sleep with her because her husband's out of town. It's interesting that sometimes people can convince themselves and convince others that fornication is okay with God. I know I've heard a Christian tell me that he really struggled with committing fornication and everything, and that he had reason in his mind, well, he's covered by the grace of God. And so people can make all kind of justifications and rationalizations, and so this woman is sort of doing that. And Solomon says, do not be led by her as an ox to the slaughter. The ox does not even know what's about to happen, that he's about to be killed. So he ends the chapter talking about how we need to realize the danger of the immoral woman. He says, the immoral woman has slain a mighty army of men. Do not think yourself in no danger from her. It's so common for people to think, well, it won't happen to me. I can be in this situation and that situation. It won't happen to me. I'll be okay. I know, other people have messed up, but I'm not like that. I'm strong, and that's just not going to happen. 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. So flee. Fornication is not something to flirt with. A young man who is seeking to serve the Lord may deliberately do something like go to the beach or go to some party or deliberately date a girl with a bad reputation, just maybe to get a bit of a thrill. But he doesn't want to go all the way. He doesn't think that's going to happen. He doesn't see the obvious trap. But it is a trap. That's the thing. We have to see it as a trap.
And so Solomon, along with Paul, cries out, run the other way. Don't stop to be tempted. Don't put yourself in that position, as Tom was saying earlier. Let me ask you, what are some other foolish situations men put themselves in with women not realizing the danger? Now, we kind of already touched on this earlier, so we may not have any new thoughts on that. Debbie?
I think a lot of people get into situations in their workplace, and we kind of talked about it before about the lunch thing. It happens all the time. You see people meeting people at work,
Right.
and I think you have to be very, very careful. Like, I would never go out to lunch with a man at work without other people present.
Great example, yeah.
And even like working in team environments, sometimes your partner, if you're on projects or things like that, you have to be careful where you're sitting and how you're talking, and the focus is on the work, because it starts to lead into the personal, and people are having an emotional affair, or whatever they like to call it. So I think work is
Absolutely.
where it happens.
Absolutely. And that's where we spend the majority of our time, most people who work full time. So if you're away from your spouse and you're at work for the majority of your day, you're around all these other people, members of the opposite sex, and you're developing relationships with them because you're working with them. Boy, that's dangerous. We just have to be really guarded, really, really, really careful about that. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Jeff?
It's very dangerous to have the thought that you never get caught, that you keep this under wraps. And my thought is, how many leaders have we seen, whether it's sports figures or business men and women or politicians, just in recent history, that have been taken down because of inappropriate activities with someone of the opposite gender? They had no plans that this would ruin their career or take them down from a position they've been all their life, but it does time and time again.
Yes.
And it's because they think, I won't get caught.
Right.
I can handle this.
Yeah.
And get taken down every time.
Yes. We cannot be too careful. Let's go to Proverbs 8. Wisdom calls to men to learn her value. Wisdom here is personified as a lady crying out in the gates of the city, urging all of those who are naive to hear her voice. She tries to convince them of her truth and of her priceless value. This is essentially God, through His Word, calling to us to come, listen to this wisdom. And wisdom, again, enumerates her gifts. You will be so much more blessed when you pursue wisdom. Wisdom hates evil. She gives rulers their positions of honor. And again, a repetition of the blessings stated earlier. Riches and honor are stated there. In verses 22 through 31, wisdom helped God create the world. She was there before the world was ever created. She was working right there alongside God as His master craftsman. And she was just rejoicing in His creation. And one of the points I get from that is wisdom doesn't change with the whims of culture. Because true wisdom was there before there was culture, before there were nations, before there was worldly wisdom, there was true wisdom. And that wisdom never changes. And blessed is the man who listens to wisdom. Chapter 9, I've got 58 seconds. Chapter 9, wisdom invites all to her feast. She's prepared this feast, sent out her maidens to invite the naive to come and eat her food and drink her wine. Again, God calls us to come feast on the riches of His wisdom. The middle section in this chapter is a little random for the flow. And so I'm going to go straight to that last section, and we can read this starting in verse 13 of chapter 9. And we'll end with this. The woman of folly is boisterous. She is naive and knows nothing. She sits by the doorway of her house, on a seat by the high places of the city, calling to those who pass by, who are making their paths straight. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. So she's saying the same thing that true wisdom does. And to him who lacks understanding, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. Really, doesn't even need any commentary. Pretty self-explanatory. Please read through page 187A for next Sunday. Wednesday, we're going to be having a singing. Thanks, everybody, for all your thoughts and comments.